producing a lot of vegetables by itself.
Mm-hmm.
So schools really like to promote on their web pages that, for example, we are in South.
So one last session for today, unfortunately. As we're running a bit short on time, I've cut it a bit short, but no worries, you'll definitely get a chance to do one more debate, or a quick debate with each other. What I'm going to do is very briefly go into the idea what could be common fallacies you will see used against you. Usually, there are probably a lot of bad tricks you can use in rhetorics. It's not really my idea to teach them. I don't think they're very nice. And usually, if you're an environmentalist, you have rather limited use of bad tricks, I feel. It's usually rather what you can use is defending yourselves against some of those concepts and trying to make the best out of it. Because assuming we have good rational arguments for most things, then our goal would rather be to advance those than to use any emotional guilt trips or whatever might be reasonable. So what are common fallacies that you should avoid and you should try to defend yourself against? One concept which is very, very known and popular is the idea of a straw man argument, which you might have heard. You have a rather complex position, or at least you think it's very complex, and the other person tries to make it seem extreme, to the ridiculous. Say when the policy was to have vegetarian food in all university cafeterias, and somebody strawmans the argument by saying, so you want to ban all meat consumption. So you want to stop us to eating meat. How is this going to work whatsoever? That's taking one of your points, one of the key ideas, namely reducing something a bit in some areas to the extreme where it becomes easier to destroy it. So that's a very common strategy that people try to make your point seem as extreme as possible because it's easier to take down then. Common strategy against it, you can be preemptive if you know this happens a lot in those cases and already mention it beforehand. Kind of the thing we talked about, saying that our goal is obviously not to do X, Y, Z. Our goal is to do this in this specific area. Or our goal is obviously not to solve all the world's problems and to make sure that there is no CO2 emissions whatsoever, but our goal is to reduce them significantly in this specific area. To kind of make sure that, yes, you don't want to solve all the problems, yes, you're aware you can't solve all the problems, but you can improve situations in some cases, and with this specific policy. So if you feel that you're being strawmanned, if you feel that your position is shown to extreme, try to point it out, try to point out that that's not what you're saying and that's not what this debate is about or this discussion is about. This discussion is about a specific narrow field. And usually you have a much easier chance winning in those specific areas. And I'd recommend trying to win area by area usually than to win an extreme case, which will be very hard. So it's tough to not get drawn into it, especially when you kind of agree with the principle you're supposed to defend, but try to stick with the key point. This general idea between cause and effect is very, very common, that people might mistake what's the cause, what's the effect of a policy, and might claim some sort of false correlations. I don't know. Actually, from the top of my head, I can't come up with a good example for environment. A classical false correlation would be like these third variable things, where people would say, oh, people with larger feet tend to have a higher income. So that's scientifically sound, but that belongs to the fact that men have larger feet than women, and women are systematically discriminated in the job market. So there are certain things where one variable correlating with the other doesn't lead to the result. And people will try to claim false correlations and will try to force you into false beliefs. So you could probably say that meat consumption goes hand in hand with a higher economic development, which is probably true if you look into most countries, that more developed countries tend to eat more meat. But then the question is, do they eat more meat because they're higher developed, or are they so higher developed and do we need all the energy to be the fancy, amazing people we apparently are, and therefore we need meat consumption? So probably not. And so you can always try to make those correlations and try to point out what leads to what, and if something is correlated at all. Same goes with tradition. Like, we've always done this, it's a very common argument, we've continued to do this, people will not like it. That's probably true for most policies, and the simple fact that we've done things for a long period of time might hint that something is nice, might make us imagine that there's some sort of deeper correlation, but there's no proof whatsoever. Like, there's been oppression of women, oppression of black people, oppression of pretty much every minority or majority group you can imagine throughout history. So simple fact that tradition exists doesn't mean anything. If you want to argue by tradition yourself for some points, try to figure out why have we done so in the past. Like, what's the reason behind the tradition, and then argue with those points. I think that's a lot better than just simply stating we've always cared a lot about the environment, we have some sort of spiritual connection deep in the past. I think that might be interesting, but figuring out why is that the case, like why does being connected to the environment, growing your own food, for example, makes you, I don't know, like more at ease with yourself. There are probably good rational arguments for that that are a lot better than the underlying concept of we've been doing this for so long, let's keep on doing it, because that's ultimately not very convincing. And same idea of focusing on irrelevant points. In the best case, try to limit your arguments to a scope where that's not even the case. If it happens, try to cut the debate short on those ones. I mean, sometimes we say things that are stupid. Happens. We use an example that doesn't work. If the discussion starts to derail, try to point that out. Say, okay, maybe that's not the best example. Maybe that's not that relevant. But let's talk about point A, B, C. So if you feel the discussion is getting out of hand or on a point which you can't win, there's no shame in admitting that in some areas you lose and trying to get the discussion back to the points that you think are important. Because ultimately, you don't win a debate by winning some petty small point that derails the entire discussion. You win a debate or any discussion by winning the 1 or 2 key points. So try to always bring back the discussion to those. Identify what is important to you, bring it back to it. How do you do that? Like, what would be possible options for doing it? I'd say there are maybe 4 key strategies of doing it. Probably not going to write this down. I think usually weighing is one of the concepts I really like about the weighing. What are things that you can weigh? So weighing means, first of all, acknowledging that the other side has points. In almost all debates, when you want to change something, the other side will have points. There will be somewhat good logical reasons for why we've been doing something for a long time, and it's very difficult to deny the fact that the other side might have some good reasons for change. So acknowledging them to some degree, saying that yes, there might be some value in this point, is a good strategy, because you immediately become more credible, at least to, say, a more rational audience, or even to people who initially disagree with you. If you stand up with a very, very strong counter stance, people who strongly disagree initially with you will immediately shut off listening. Or even people who intermediately disagree with you will have a hard time following you if you don't acknowledge their viewpoint, their point of view. So trying to acknowledge that there are some trade-offs, but then go into why, despite those trade-offs, your points are more important. One thing I would say is importance of principles. That could be in this vegetarianism debate, the principle, say, of personal liberty. I want to eat whatever I want and I don't want to be limited by any ways. Of course, limiting the amount or the type of food you can eat in a cafeteria limits your personal freedom. But you can, A, try to see how much does it limit your freedom. So try to narrow that down, say what does personal freedom mean. It's probably a broader concept, it probably has a lot of more repercussions, and not being able to choose freely what you eat is probably a very small limitation of your individual freedom. And try to find good reasons for why that is so. Why individual expression can be in a lot of other ways, why maybe you're already limited, say, by your budget, or why not all cafeterias offer all types of food anyway. So there's limitations naturally, and this is a very small one. And on the other hand, what's the counterexample? Say combating climate change, say reducing the budget we need for food. Why are those more important examples? Why is maybe your individual preference and getting something you like less important than preventing a bigger environmental catastrophe? What's the impact again on this? Like, will stop eating meat mean like a lot to the environment or rather a limited impact? And then trying to weigh those points. It's tricky, it's complicated, like you have to spend some time in it, you have to spend some time in nuancing, but ultimately I guess if you really want to convince someone, that's a lot more likely than going the hard line and simply saying in all cases, under all circumstances, this is more important than X. Something you can practice over time. Second point, I guess, would be likeliness. So you can weigh the likeliness of certain events, like how often will things happen? What is if something doesn't happen? Say, you can always say that, oh, but it's very, very unlikely this policy fails. It's very, very unlikely that, say, nuclear power stations are subject to some bigger error or some terrorist attack or whatever. So then you can weigh likeliness versus impact, depending on your position. Say you're very much in favor of nuclear power, you could try to focus on, yes, the impact is very big, but the likeliness that something bad will happen is so low that we shouldn't overemphasize it. If you think that nuclear power is a terrible idea, you can of course try to phrase it exactly the other way around, that yes, the likeliness is small, but the impact will be so big. And to then come to a conclusion, it would be good to have some sort of scientific backing. Say calculations on how likely it is, what could be the impact, what would be the ultimate result. Say, are insurance companies willing to insure like bigger negative effects if a nuclear power station crashes, for example, which they don't. So that might be a good hint that maybe the cost benefit might not be that high. But again, I'm saying this from a German perspective. I think every other country thinks nuclear power is awesome. Okay, and So, and linked to this idea of likeliness is also a bit the idea of feasibility. So I think one of the big issues if you're an environmentalist is it's fairly easy to win the point what we want is morally right. I guess most people kind of think, yeah, environmentalists are usually morally right. The tricky point is, yes, this will work. This is somehow possible to do. So again, likeliness not only in the sense how likely is an event to happen, but also likeliness in how likely will this policy lead to an actual result, how likely are we to enforce it. So kind of make sure that this is not just a dream, not just an idealistic, fluffy goal, but there have been case studies, there have been good examples for how this works, there are good logical reasons to assume that it works. So taking it at some points, and I think that's one of the issues we might have more in the Loomis group than in other groups, taking it from being morally right to being feasible. So at some points focusing slightly less in discussions on why this is the right thing to do, but also why it is possible to do so. And the last point, I guess, would be plausibility. So again, weighing certain sources. It's usually very easy, or not very easy, but if you're a good speaker, it's somewhat easy to create narratives for both sides of the topic. So what you and it's easy to find examples for both sides of any topic. So what you would want to do is find good reasons for why yours is more plausible. Like, does it require fewer logical assumptions? Like, is it on more likely, based on more likely hypothesis and not on very specific cases? Or is it maybe more plausible because the facts you base it on, the scientific research, is more credible because it's published in a bigger, more important scientific journal, because it's not in a study funded by, say, a large oil company or whatever. So if you are able to look at how credible are the sources, how credible is the scientific outcome, you can always reduce the plausibility and say that, yes, you might also have a counter study for why oil drilling in a certain Southern American country doesn't increase cancer rates, but that study was funded by Shell. So even if that study exists, even if it is by a reasonable scientist, maybe we're a little bit less likely to believe in it than in this counter study by an independent association published in Science or whatever. So even if you have counter examples, trying to weigh the plausibility might be a really reasonable strategy to do. So yeah, I hope those are kind of ideas you can do. Okay, and last point. So those were 3 points. Fourth point that you could make would be an even-if analysis, which I find is personally very awesome. So I think in maybe scientific debates you don't always have to do it. In private debates where you don't have all the facts at hand, it's very, very difficult to find counter studies to what people are claiming, but you still want to get your point through. Often it is possible to say that even if your point is true, even if that's true, then we still have the environmental benefit, we still have our obligation as humans in our society. So even if your point is true, we should still do the morally right thing, or we should still enact this policy. And I think that's kind of connected to the idea acknowledging the opposite. Under these circumstances, not acknowledging it to a full extent, just acknowledging the fact that you can't disprove it for now, but saying that even if it was true, we should still do something else. And again, that's something that makes it easier to convince someone of who's from a different opinion, just because you make a step towards them, take them serious, but still show why your arguments are more important. So I would try to go for those ideas. Okay, so those are different concepts you can make. As we don't have very much time, I had a very nice task, which maybe future batches, if you're watching, can do, which is 3-chair model. Which means I've talked a bit about this acknowledging idea, this idea of acknowledging other people, sometimes paraphrasing what you do. What you could imagine yourself is sitting on 3 different chairs when in a group discussion, when giving a speech. So you would sit on the first chair and quickly paraphrase what the other person has said. You could say so you pointed out that meat consumption is very important because it includes very valuable nutrients that we need for our nourishment. Then you go to the second one, which would be comment on the paraphrase, comment on the idea. You can say, okay, I acknowledge that, yes, this is a very important nutritional benefit, but even if that's true, we can see that there are different options, different ways of gathering your food. You can get other protein sources which are almost as valuable. And then if you've commented on it and say, for example, usually in most discussions it could stop here and it could bounce back and forth. So you have a paraphrase, you give your counter argument, next person does the same thing. Quick paraphrase, quick argument. You bounce back and forth. Eventually you might end up in a dead end where you feel that we've sufficiently discussed this, we can't really agree. What you can do, same strategy, paraphrase, counter argument, and then hop on to the third chair, which would be to introduce a new argument. And then you could say, independent of nutritional value and whether it's necessary or not, I think we should also discuss what are the environmental impacts and what's our responsibility as human beings. And then kind of by structuring this in those 3 steps, like you sufficiently argued it, you kind of make sure that we can't really agree. Maybe you can even make a quick statement saying, okay, we both don't have the numbers here. There are differing scientific views. I think it's very likely, but I can see why you disagree with this point. Let's focus on something else. And if you keep on with the strategy, if you have a longer discussion, and especially with someone you maybe like or you generally feel would want to be convinced and is interested in any sort of genuine talk, this might be a good way of simply not getting stuck on one specific argument, but from time to time advancing it. And it could be the same in any public debate where you feel that this argument is really not in your favor. How about we wrap this up rather quickly and go to something else? That you have some sort of logical structure of saying, we've run ourselves a bit into the ground in this idea, we can't agree. Let's hop to something else. So yeah, this could be something future batches could practice by just running through arguments and sitting next to each other. Okay, so what we're going to do now instead is something I'd like to call a circle discussion. First of all, quick question. Is it okay for you if we do like 10 minutes extra until 12:10? Is that reasonable? Yeah. Cool, thanks. So what I'd like to do now is we have groups of 4 people this time. In those 4 people groups, we have 2 people speaking in favor of a motion, which I'll announce soon. Don't worry, it's not the vegetarian one. And 2 people against a motion. So you have 4 people in a group. You will get 5 minutes to prepare speeches. And the structure in which you will speak afterwards, so 2 people are in favor of it, 2 people are against. And you will again get 3-minute speeches. And those should run around. So one person speaks 3 minutes in favor of a topic, 3 minutes against from the other side, 3 minutes in favor, 3 minutes against. So you have some sort of mini mock debate, which is somewhat similar to what you'll do on the 26th of February with Kim in the Rural and Urban course, where we do also a debate exercise and where every one of you will get to debate on a real debate on a bigger scale. What I'd like you to focus on in those 3 minutes are, I guess, 2 things. So first of all, as you have maybe a little longer to prepare this time, to stick with the structure, try to focus on how to find those 3 key arguments. Again, I'd recommend focusing on 2 arguments in this specific case. Second point, try to include this idea of paraphrasing and refuting other people's arguments in your structure. And that's something that I think is somewhat specific in a debate case, but can very easily be integrated here. Simply by saying that linking can also be rebuttal. Rebuttal, I'm not sure if that's a normal English word, but in debating that means answering, like directly answering what has been previously said. So this speaker can link quickly to what has been said and try to go through the arguments one by one very quickly and try to rebut them, try to find quick answers to them. So you've said this argument A, we don't think that's true for this and this reason, or we don't think that's relevant for these and these reasons. That could be the first minute of your speech, first minute and a half maybe, and then the second part of your speech you go through with your arguments in specific. So to kind of have some sort of natural flow between A, rebutting, paraphrasing, and bringing forward your own arguments. And you can do that in some sort of direct structure that 4 people speak with each other. Any questions on the structure of this? Okay. So I'd recommend for you guys already to go in groups of 4, and then I'll announce the topic, and you have 5 minutes to prepare your speeches. So feel free to find yourself some space to stand or sit. Cool. So as some of you have already did, you can see this is a concept that you can turn around in circles, and you could continue like with the first speaker, then taking up the argument again, doing some rebuttal, bringing new arguments into it, which is a pretty cool way of structuring a discussion, I think. Or at least if you have some sort of semi-formalized debate setting, that's pretty cool. And I guess when you have to debate with Kim, it will be somewhat similar to this idea. And also whenever you want to do some sort of practice debates, what I feel sometimes it helps a discussion to have more or less a formal structure so that people keep within certain time limits, keep within certain boundaries, and, well, sometimes limitations can be quite, well, liberating in another way as well. Simply because you're forced to stick within a certain limit, you'll be able to express yourself better within the group discussion. So that might be something to consider. What I'm doing is a very, very brief wrap-up, and then we're 50 minutes over time, so you very well deserved the end of the session. So what could be the take-home message? What would be the things we've learned? I'll just really briefly go through some ideas. If you have some feedback, unfortunately we don't have much time now, so maybe you'll contact me afterwards, talk to me, or whatever you're interested in. I'll just give you some ideas that I've found important. So first of all, this question, what's your burden of proof, which we've already talked about. When you see a question, when you want to convince people, what's the goal you want to aim at with the policy you go for? What's the mechanism, like how do you arrive at that goal? For example, by banning meat, for example, by having ICA produce locally food or only sell locally food. And why is this better than the alternatives? I guess that's usually the burden of proof in many questions, having that as some sort of mindset and just if you're not always that structured, just following those principles and looking into it might be very helpful. Second question connected to that, what's the audience? Like what's your relationship, the triangle we had earlier of yourself, the content and the knowledge, and the audience you're talking to. Like, is the person you talk to, like I've talked quickly with Taraj, like sometimes the person you're debating with is not the person you want to convince as well. Maybe sometimes you have a public debate against somebody from a different party, of a different conviction, who you really want to convince is not them, but the audience listening to you. Sometimes you have school children as an audience, sometimes you have CEOs of a company. There's a vast amount, and tailoring your message to what they have as a knowledge, what they have as goals is very, very important, and a helpful thing to think about. The third question is kind of, and that might be especially important for those of you who struggled a bit with filling 3 minutes of speech, to look at how deep do I want to go into arguments, and how often do I want to ask myself the question why. If we lose this and this tradition, why is this bad? If we lose these and these behaviors and freedoms, why is that a really bad limitation? And asking yourself why in specific context makes the argument deeper, makes you talk for a longer period, and makes it more understandable for people listening to it who are not already convinced. And I think that's usually the point you're trying to make with debating, convincing those who don't already agree with your premises, at least in an ideal world. Fourth thing you could take away is that structure might help, especially when you know less about a topic, and practicing to speak about things which you don't agree with or things that you know very little of helps you to remember the structure, go into it, and speak well in pretty much any context. And that might be an extremely helpful tool. And as a last point, it's very helpful to take the other person serious while still firmly disagreeing with them. Acknowledge that they might have some points to say, but be strict in the way you counter-argue them, and try to paraphrase maybe some points, but then find good rebuttals and good counter-arguments, and let them bounce back and forth between true alternatives. So if there's a strawman argument, try to not build them up yourselves, and try to deconstruct them if somebody else builds up weak arguments or tries to make your position seem more extreme than it is. So you can get back to real comparisons, like compare different principles, what is more important, compare different mechanisms, what actually works in real life, compare real plausibility, like what are reasonable scientific sources which aren't, and try to get back to this like real weighing of arguments as one option of doing it. So to end with a little advertisement, I've already wrote our name in here, that's Lund Debate Society. So if you're interested in debating a bit more, what we do is usually 7-minute speeches, 50 minutes preparation time, and 8 people in a debate. So it's pretty big. We have people who are very, very new to debating who've almost never done it, especially now with the new semester starting, and some very experienced debaters. And we train every Tuesday, which is from 7 to 9 p.m. in Kulturanatom. That's in Bischofsgatan 7. Well, pretty much down the road. If you turn down the road, turn left. Bischofsgatan 7. Pretty easy to find. So that's from 7 to 9 with food served at 6. It's even vegan food cooked by myself and some other people. So yeah, very invited to join. And on Thursdays we have debate trainings from, so for example today from 6 to 9 usually. So if you haven't had enough debating, you could even join today at 6. But I guess that could be quite a lot. So if you're interested in that, you're very, very invited. Send me a message, ask whatever you want. That's equally true for future Loomis people. So cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.